Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about, how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room? Sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure. And bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury. Thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure? It was just beginning. The house that couldn't keep out a breeze. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle-and-daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants? They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard. The enemy beneath, fighting the frozen ground. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulated back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw, into your bones, and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor, if you could afford it. Or, more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often, they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. The heart of the home. The eternal flame. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan, but on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty: stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. The art of banking the fire. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child, like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire-banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. Human heaters, the power of body warmth. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So, next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. Livestock, the unconventional roommates. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow. It's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells, legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets. And pigs? Well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch or stepping barefoot into something. Suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. Layers upon layers. Medieval winter fashion. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic under-tunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations. You are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry, if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. The strategic filth. Dirt as insulation. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical. Strategic. Dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem. Heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud, but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. Straw beds and rush floors, sleeping on plants. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stork. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, to mask the overwhelming odor of livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." Stuffing the gaps. The never-ending battle. When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance. They're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts, and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. Sleeping in shifts. The night watch. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud. Sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. The art of controlled breathing. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say, "Hail Mary," that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and, most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, It beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter, eating for warmth, fuel for the body's furnace. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon: a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too: oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A bellyful of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard? Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Hot stones and hay boxes, medieval heating pads. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better: rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed, a medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot? Well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. Sleeping near the fire, strategic positioning. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness. It was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge and, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. you're still alive. You're still warm. For now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. Community warmth. No one survives alone. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish, frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair, it was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. Faith, prayer, and superstition. Spiritual survival. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's front-line defense. Saint Blaise, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments, not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. When winter won, the grim reality, for all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic. It was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold, too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror: frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death. It's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. The legacy of resilience, what they left behind. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful. A legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pool resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter, that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did, because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm. Future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights. All of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Medieval peasants didn't conquer winter. They survived it. Night after brutal night, generation after generation, they faced the impossible and found a way through, not with comfort or ease, but with courage, cleverness, and an iron will that refused to break. Their story is not one of heroes in shining armor or grand battles won. It's the story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things simply by waking up each morning, tending the fire, sharing what little they had, and daring to hope for one more sunrise. In their struggle, we find something timeless, a reminder that survival isn't about having the best tools or the softest beds. It's about refusing to give up, about finding warmth in each other when the world grows cold, about building something meaningful even when the odds are stacked against you. The medieval peasants may be long gone, but their legacy lives on. In every act of kindness during hard times, in every creative solution to an impossible problem, in every community that comes together when winter, literal or metaphorical, arrives at the door. They survived the coldest nights in history. And in doing so, they taught us all how to endure.